Now if we're going to do some cuttings, the first thing to do is fill your container with your propagating media. You may use a big tray like that if you're doing a lot of cuttings. Some nurseries and certainly hobby gardeners might only use tubes like this and put one cutting in each tube. Or if you're doing several cuttings of the one type of plant, you might put, depending on the type of plant, anything from 10 to 50 or more cuttings in a single pot like that. Of course, the more cuttings you put in the one pot or in the one tray, the closer they are together and the more likely they are to create humidity between the cuttings and foster disease, and you're likely to have more of a disease problem. But if you've got cuttings on plants which don't have all that much of a disease problem, well then it doesn't matter to have them that close together. Now, as I say, you fill the container, you put the container in some water, as we're doing there. The water fills the pot, take it out and let it drain off. Very important to have good drainage holes in the bottom of your pots too. See, that's an excellent tube. That's got heaps of little drainage holes around the bottom, as has that. That big pot there only has 4 drainage holes, but they're big drainage holes and they're quite adequate for the sort of container it is. So we get rid of most of the excess water, and then we can go about preparing and doing our cuttings. Now, if you say going to do a cutting of a plant like that, a Westringia, you may take a tip cutting. That's possible. You always cut just below a bud, so you've got buds there. You might remove the leaves by hand like that. I'm doing this rather slowly. Commercial propagator would do it a lot faster. I'm just pinching off those. But if I pull the leaves, while pulling them down, that's working reasonably well there. But in some cases, if I pull the leaves, I may end up stripping some bark off, and that's not good. You don't want that sort of situation arising. There's little flower buds there. I don't want those flower buds on it. I might even just take that tip out because I don't want the flower buds there. I could use that as a cutting. That would be one possibility. Another way to do it would be to take a cutting off the side with a heel. What I mean by a heel, when I peel that cutting off, I'm taking a little bit of the old wood, the wood from the previous year's growth. See, that's grown over the last year, and the wood down here has grown the year before that, so I'm taking the older wood away. I might decide that I want to use a razor like that just to trim that up. Be very careful with the razor. If you have that problem of the tissue stripping off, some people become very proficient at just removing the leaves with a razor. Sharp blade like that can remove the leaves. You can see I'm removing a fair quantity of leaves off that cutting. Can take the last few of them off like that. That's got some flower buds there too, which you don't want on a cutting. So you end up with something like that. See how much leaf I've taken off. Similar sort of procedure with other plants. This is a Crowea exhalata, a little native shrub. I could take a side shoot like that and turn that into a cutting. Just taking off all those leaves there and end up with something like that. Some people these days, if they're short on cutting materials, are taking very small cuttings too. Things like that. You can see that's much shorter. That one's maybe 3 or 4 inches long. What's that, about 8 centimetres or 10 centimetres long? That one's half or less than half the length. But once again, same sort of story. Remove half to 2/3 of the leaves. You end up with something like that, and that can make a nice little cutting that you can propagate from. With conifers, similar sort of situation. Depending on the plant, sometimes you take tip cuttings, like that. You make a cutting like that. Sometimes you might take a side shoot, pull a piece off the side like that with a bit of the old wood and turn that into a cutting. So that sort of thing could become a cutting. Probably the tip cuttings are a little more common with something like that, because you're going to get a bit younger and more vigorous wood. There are other ways of doing cuttings too. Like ivy, while you could take a tip cutting on ivy, you can also do ivy from what we call a leaf bud cutting, where you basically just take one leaf like that with one bud where the leaf joins the old wood and a tiny little bit of old wood, and that can be planted to produce a cutting, to produce a new plant. So to plant these cuttings in a pot, we often just use a pencil thickness piece of stick. You make a hole, you put the cutting in, leaf bud or whatever, and you compact the potting media down around the base of the cutting. Make another hole, put the cutting in, compact it around the base of the cutting. Another hole, put the cutting in, compact it around the base, and so on, and you can just fill your pot with cuttings like that. Now, there's one thing I'm doing here that you wouldn't normally do, and that is, and if you could avoid it, and that is mix different varieties of plants in the one pot. Because what's going to happen is you'll find the conifer might take 6 months to a year or year and a half to get roots on it, whereas the crowea and the ivy might be ready to pot up after a month or two, depending on where you put it and how you treat it. So you're going to be wanting to knock the cuttings out of the pot to pot up some of them, but other ones won't even be anywhere near having the roots ready and being ready to pot up. For that reason, when you do your cuttings, it's probably best to just keep all of the one variety in the pot. Certainly if you're doing it commercially, you do it that way. If you're aware of that problem and you're doing it as a hobby, well, fair enough. Sometimes you might knock the cuttings out of the pot and replant the ones that haven't propagated. To give plants a better chance to form roots, sometimes we use rooting hormones. Certainly with the plants which are more hard to get roots on as a cutting, you would try to use a rooting hormone. What a rooting hormone does is it's a chemical that sends a signal through the plant and stimulates the roots to grow. This one is indole butyric acid, and it's in a liquid form. Now, you can also get the same chemical there in a powder form. The powder form is just the IBA, or indole butyric acid, mixed up with talcum powder. If you wet the base of a cutting, just dip it in water, and then you dip it in that talc with the IBA, a certain amount of talc will adhere to the base of the cutting, and that's going to transfer some IBA and stimulate the roots to grow on that cutting. You might say, why use the liquid? Now, the only advantage, or main advantage of the liquid, is you can change the concentration of the liquid. You can add a little bit of that liquid to water, or you can add a lot of the liquid to water. You can have it very concentrated or very weak. And what you will find, some plants tend to absorb the hormone faster than others. If you've got a plant that grows slowly and has a slow flowing sap system, such as many of your conifers, now those sorts of plants, they're just going to absorb that IBA, or that hormone, very, very slowly. When you've got other plants that grow very rapidly, maybe something like a chrysanthemum, that's going to absorb the IBA very fast. Now, if you've got a plant that absorbs the IBA fast, you can have a very strong concentration of IBA, and just dip the cutting in it and out very quickly, or maybe dip it in for 5 seconds or 10 seconds, and it absorbs the hormone into the cutting. If you've got a plant with a slower metabolism and it's absorbing that hormone more slowly, well, you can make a very weak solution of the hormone, put it in a glass jar or whatever, dip the cutting into that and just let it stand there for hours, maybe even overnight, and gradually it absorbs up the hormone. The two treatments, dipping a long time in a weak solution or a short time in a strong solution, may achieve exactly the same results, ending up with exactly the same amount of hormone in the cutting. So it's just you use different techniques for different cuttings. You can also get, here's a hormone, same hormone, indole acid, in a gel, and that's just another way to get it. In that situation, that's just like a liquid there. You can take the cutting, dip it in the gel, and a certain amount will stay on the base of the cutting. And then after you've done that, you simply plant the cutting. Put it in your pot. I've got a bit of rock wool there too, and that rock wool's now wet. If we want to plant cuttings in the rock wool, all we have to do is just stick them in. They just go in very easily. But if you stick that cutting into the rock wool that far, that's fine, because the base of the cutting is in the centre of the rock wool. But if you stick it in like that, the base of the cutting is going to be right at the base of the rock wool, and that's no good. What you will find with rock wool, because you've got so much water in there, you have a pressure from the water on the top to the water on the bottom, and it does tend to be a bit wetter at the base than what it is up top. And if you put the base of the cutting right down there, well, the base of that cutting is going to be in a very wet situation. If you put it up there, it's maybe in a more average level of water. You don't want it right down there. It's more likely to rot right down there. You want the base of the cutting up there. So if you use rock wool, just poke it in a little way, not too far.